Hello, and in this video, we're going to be talking about the signs, positive, negative, or zero, for the two main trigonometric functions that we're going to be exploring in this class, sine and cosine. So here we've got our standard Cartesian coordinate system with positive x pointing to the right and positive y pointing up. And that leaves us with four quadrants that we number 1, 2, 3, and 4, going counterclockwise from that positive x-axis. Okay? And again, as a reminder, the two main trigonometric functions that we're going to be exploring, if we remember our SOHCAHTOA mnemonic that you may have heard in high school or whatever, are cosine, which is the adjacent side over the hypotenuse of a triangle, and sine, the opposite side from the angle over the hypotenuse. So let's see how the signs, S-I-G-N, behave for sine and cosine in each of these four quadrants. So we'll begin with an angle here in the first quadrant. Here in the first quadrant, you can see I've sort of drawn a picture here of an angle. We're always going to define the hypotenuse as a positive quantity. It's a distance. It's a distance from the origin. It's always positive. And if we're thinking about the sine of this angle, then we need to look at the opposite side from that angle. And so the opposite side here is going vertically. Always be careful on where's the opposite and where's the adjacent. Here, the opposite side is vertical. So it's going towards the positive y direction. So that tells us that our opposite side is positive and the hypotenuse is always positive. So the sine of an angle in the first quadrant is going to be positive. Similarly, the cosine of an angle in the first quadrant is also going to be positive. Again, the hypotenuse is always a positive quantity. It's a distance. And in this case, the adjacent side to this angle is along the positive x direction. So we've got a positive over a positive, meaning that the cosine is a positive number. Now let's move into the second quadrant. Remember, angles are always measured from our positive x-axis by default, so coming around like this. So there's our angle in the second quadrant. The sine of this angle is, again, positive, because if we look at the little triangle, the opposite side is along the positive y direction. And so the opposite side is positive. The hypotenuse is always positive. So the sine of this angle in the second quadrant is a positive quantity. In contrast, the cosine is actually negative because the adjacent side points to the negative x direction, is along the negative x direction. So we've got a negative adjacent over a positive hypotenuse, leading us with a negative value for the cosine of this angle. Coming all the way around to quadrant 3 here, we've got a similar game. So in this case, now the sine, when we look at the opposite side of this angle for the sine, we see that the opposite side is along the negative y direction, downwards. Hypotenuses are, again, always positive. So a negative number over a positive number is negative. And just like in quadrant 2, the adjacent side is also along the negative x-axis. So the cosine is also going to be negative in this quadrant. Finally, we come around to our final quadrant, quadrant 4. And in this case, the sine, the opposite side, is still along the negative y-axis. So the sine is going to be negative. But the cosine is once again along the positive y-axis, which means that for the cosine, the adjacent is positive. The hypotenuse is always positive. Positive over positive is a positive. And that leaves us with the sine, S-I-G-N, for sine, S-I-N-E, and cosine in each of the four quadrants. In quadrant 1, both are positive. In quadrant 2, sine is positive, cosine is negative, because in quadrant 2, y is positive, x is negative. Down in quadrant 3, here, there, both x and y are negative, so both sine and cosine are negative. And then in quadrant 4, y is negative, x is positive, and so sine is negative and cosine is positive. Now, this is only for angles that are measured counterclockwise from the positive x-axis. If you measure your angles in some other way, you might get different values, but this is what happens when you measure your angle in the usual way. In addition to positive and negative for each of the 4 quadrants, there are certain angles that are really worth knowing the sine and the cosine for. And so we're going to go through those. Fortunately, there's not too much to memorize. There's only really 4 that we're going to talk about here. The first one is 0 degrees. So if we're looking at 0 degrees, then there is no opposite side. There's no verticality to that triangle. It's a line. So that tells us that the opposite side has length 0. The hypotenuse has some value, it doesn't matter, because 0 over anything is going to be 0. So the sine of 0 degrees is 0. In contrast, the adjacent side is the hypotenuse. I mean, think of a little triangle here, and you make it smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until it's flat. So in that case, sort of thinking in terms of that limit, the adjacent and the hypotenuse are the same, whatever they are. So it's going to be some number over itself, which is going to be positive 1. Moving around to 90 degrees, we sort of have the reverse situation. In this case, there is no adjacent. We've taken our triangle and expanded it up. And so now there's no adjacent side, but there is an opposite side. And the opposite side is the same as the hypotenuse. Just like for 0 degrees, the adjacent side was the same as the hypotenuse. So the sine of 90 degrees is equal to 1, while the cosine of 90 degrees is equal to 0. Continuing our shifts by 90 degrees around the circle, we come to 180. And now we're sort of back into our original setup that we were in with 0 degrees, right? There is no opposite side, so the sine is 0. And in terms of the cosine, the adjacent and the hypotenuse are the same length, but remember the convention is that the hypotenuse is always positive. It's a distance. Meanwhile, the adjacent is in the negative x direction. So the adjacent is minus the hypotenuse. So we've got minus hypotenuse over hypotenuse is -1. And then for the last one, 270 degrees, we're again similar to the 90 degree case where we have no adjacent and all opposite. In the case of the opposite, now the opposite side is minus the hypotenuse. So the sine is -1. And the cosine is equal to 0 because there just isn't an adjacent side to this angle. So this is what I expect you to have memorized in terms of trigonometry. I don't expect you to have the full unit circle memorized, the 30 degrees, the 60 degrees, the 45 degrees, the 120 degrees, all that. That I don't expect, though you might memorize some of them just in the process of analyzing a bunch of situations. But what I do want you to have memorized are, for each quadrant, 1, 2, 3, and 4, is the sine and cosine function positive or negative? And for each multiple of 90, 0 degrees, 90 degrees, 180 degrees, 270 degrees, is sine and cosine 1, -1, or 0? This concludes this video.